All right, all right. How's it going, everybody? Welcome to this week's Griscom stream. Sorry, I've been. Oh, I got a little bit of playback going on. Oh, here we go. Sorry about that. I've been a little bit out of the game for a little while. I've been traveling, getting stuff taken care of. So very happy to be back here, though. And there's a couple of things I want to get to today, but definitely hop in the chat whenever you're ready with questions because I'm very curious what all of y'all have been sort of thinking about working through over these past couple of weeks. For folks who aren't familiar, these are a little bit more laid back, hangout, sort of question and answer chats. Usually I try to work through something with y'all, but I'm always happy to go wherever you want to talk about a lot of different things. Matt and I just recorded a really great interview with Victor Puggi, who was at the Intercept Brazil over the past few years while they found and released all of those leaked documents that exposed the sham of Lava Jato. So really exciting interview, sort of goes through the history of that process and also some very interesting analysis for what the future of Brazilian politics are looking like, particularly regarding the military, which played such a large role in Bolsonaro's regime. So I want to make sure, to hype that up because that's going to be really great. I'm also really excited we're starting to workshop these. So I'm definitely happy to hear your suggestions. And thanks so much, William, for the first chat here. Again, throw those in there and I'll be sure to respond to as many as I can. We always appreciate, super chats. They really help us keep the YouTube channel afloat. But we're working on a new kind of project for patrons, and I'm excited for our first installment. It's probably a few weeks out, but we're going to be talking with Paul O'Connell, one of our friends in the UK, an incredible political philosopher and organizer and professor there. We're going to be talking to him about James Connolly, one of the great Irish Marxists, and I'm really looking forward to that. But we're going to sort of be launching this new patron only content, where we're going to go through a thinker, right? Find a thinker that's important to somebody, be it a James Connolly or a Lenin or Rosa Luxemburg, folks like that, and go through a little bit of their biography, and then spend a bit of time, and the majority of the time, on their kind of political philosophy. So that's something to be looking forward to over the next couple of weeks. And it's a great time to become a patron and help support that work as we're really trying to launch more and more of that kind of patrons only content. And how that we're about a month into the show Left Reckoning. Thank you all the folks who have been here from the beginning. It means a lot to us all. Let's see. Let me get to this first question before we get too many in the chat here. William, who had asked a question on Patreon for us as well, asked thoughts on the bill passed in the United Kingdom that in the last hours that will see protesters facing 10 years in prison for causing annoyance. We really want to be spending time covering what's been going on in the UK on the show. I think we'll be working on, I guess we're sort of set up for this week, but maybe see if we could do an extra stream on it because it's been really shocking. One, the protests against, brutal murder and obvious, misogyny and police abuse. But as, William notes here, they just pushed through this, and I didn't realize that had gone through yet. But there was this, everyone's moronic friend and just like a walking Humpty Dumpty, Boris Johnson passed this bill or pushed through this bill, and I guess it's passed now, that essentially criminalizes protest. And it does so in incredibly, loose terms. So you could be arrested for, a single person protest, or as this person was noting there, for causing an annoyance, right? Basically setting up the terms for how they can criminalize protest in the broadest possible context. I mean, there's the first reaction obviously is disgust and to be worried. And then the second one, of course, is that this is the trend. I mean, we're seeing the same thing in the United States. We just spent a lot of time, and this will premiere on Thursday, talking with Puggi about what happened in Brazil with Lava Jato and lawfare, about how, a lot of these basic, not just like a lot of these basic rights one are under threat, but also how people in power are just trying to, utilize the full spectrum of the repressive state apparatus, right? The police and the courts, to wage war on the left and protesters. So it's a very worrying example of what's becoming a global trend. I think it'd be really great to talk to some comrades in the UK to get a fuller analysis of it than that. But that's sort of my top line, and I'll get into a little bit later in this stream about some ways to start to think about what we're seeing globally, because I do think that there are some shifts that we need to be doing so that we don't get stuck in old maps and old models in our analysis. Yeah, let me just continue getting into these chats because it's really great to be catching up with everybody. Jay Andrew says, "How's Texas? Texas is incredible. It's my favorite place to be, so I've been very happy. Did my first barbecue last night. Turned out really well. I'm very happy for that." Yeah. Oh, somebody, what is it? Someone has a Camus joke in there. Let me be the first to say, Camus can do, but Sartre is smart. Yeah. And nobody can get, also, I'm not going to do this. Nobody get mad at me for my like American accent pronouncing Sartre. I gave up a long time ago and just had to decide that, it's better to be able to communicate clearly than to try to pronounce a bunch of French words that I will very clearly struggle with. I already struggle with English enough. I'm not going to be able to get anything like that going. All right. Daniel also notes that Kentucky also passed a bill making it illegal to insult police. That was insane. And I don't know what the repercussions of that I mean, obviously the repercussions of that is that the police are going to crack down on protesters. I'm saying I don't know what like the political scene is there for being able to push back against that. That's insane. That just flies in the face of any. I mean, we already knew that the right wing in this country, when they talked about, and this is the only this is the last great experiment. This is the one democratic experiment in humanity. We already knew that they were full of shit, because every chance that they get, they trample on those rights. You don't have to go that far back in American history, to see, first of all, what Donald Trump did. But, even Bush, typical conservative Republicans have a very, very deep hatred of, concepts like freedom of speech and the right to protest. It's a very, very frightening, a very, very frightening development that we're seeing, which is this just increasing willingness to be overt in their war against people's basic kind of democratic rights, right? In the UK, as we were just talking about with this bill, that basically interprets like an annoyance or a public nuisance in such a broad term that the police can probably be pushing it through with impunity. And that's obviously exceptionally disgusting to be happening while there are mass protests going on against police murder in that country. So someone says, what do I think about this huge Zeus, Dr. Zeus controversy? I mean, that's the great example. It's like the right wing gets worked up about cartoons while they trample on basic, democratic and constitutional rights. Obviously, it's theater. It's the only thing that they can do is what they sell to their base. They sell outrage, political theater, while they just tear up our kind of personal rights and open the doors out for the wealthy. Not that the Democratic Party doesn't do the same thing. They're just playing to a different base and a very, very different kind of cultural perspective there. All right, y'all. I'll definitely be continuing to look out for questions. Always appreciate super chats, but I wanted to make sure that we're getting into what I was wanting to talk about with the title of this video, because it's something that, I've had a couple of weeks, we've still been doing the show, but through the move and all the other things that I've been up with, I've had a little bit of time to sort of unplug from the constant feed of the news and like the Twitter debates. So definitely, if there's anything that people want me to talk about, I'll try my best. But there are a lot of things that I've just not filled in on, just because I haven't been, at home. I don't even have a desk right now in front of me. Right now is like an outdoor table. So I'm still sort of moving in. But I have been, and I'll be sure to come back to this super chat in just a second. Um, I have been thinking a lot. Well, actually, I'm gonna just go to super chat really quickly. John Michael asked, "Did you read about the Sunday Telegraph journalist who settled out of court with Ash at Novara Media?" Um, I haven't. I know that she is constantly being attacked by these just Neanderthals and nasty folks. I'll definitely look out for that, and certainly solidarity to Ash and whatever she's going through. But thanks for the tip there, and for the super chat. Really appreciate that. And yeah, no, I mean, I don't know about that. I'll definitely send me information on it. I'll look into it. So, but the UK, because of all the things that have been happening with the police in the United Kingdom, and also what's been going on in Bolivia, as there's this pushback, um, as there's been, basically the Moss government has been wanting to make sure that justice is upheld in that country after, not just the coup, but just like racist right wing mobs going through cities, harassing, beating up people, and in the worst cases, murdering folks, threatening to turn off their water. There is now a moment where Moss is trying to pursue legal options to make sure that people are being held accountable for their crimes and their activities against the people of Bolivia. Anyways, I've been thinking about these kind of things, and I've been trying to think about what are responses to them, because I've got a lot of questions about Bolivia and the UK, and I think it's important for us to zoom out for a second and not fall into a trap, because I do see that there is a shift that's going on, right? One thing that's really great about being able to do having a focus on international politics is you can start to see trends that are happening with global capital. Like, it's always going to present itself in a kind of unique cultural and political experience, within a country. But there are these kind of general trends that we're seeing capital going into. So those are what people were asking about earlier, with like, these rules that in Western democracies essentially try and outlaw protesting. That is a trend. And you have to ask yourself, one, why are they, trying to, limit our rights in that sense? Well, that's obvious, because they see the mass mobilizations as a direct threat to their rule. But then the second question has to be, how are they able to get away with this? And that starts to get into a much more entrenched and more difficult question to work through. And I don't have the answer to that today. But I wanted to, I'm bringing this up because I want us to start to think about the models that we're using to conceptualize like politics, because we are, I think, at a shift in politics, in the way that class struggle is presenting itself across the globe, but in particular in the United States and in Western countries. Because, and mainly what I wanted to focus on was like the question of austerity, because we all know like austerity is bad. We all know about all of our arguments against neoliberalism, and that being defined as like the political project to like privatize as much as possible and to pull back the government as much as possible, right? Which became the playbook of the third way, right? We know those kind of that kind of tactic from capital, right? And like the management class in society. And we know our kind of counter arguments. We haven't figured out, just saying, the kind of social movements that have been able to eradicate that. But we know, like on a personal level, in like a debate situation, how to push back. Oh, this is why austerity doesn't work, right? This is why we need to, increase our public investment, things like that, right? This is something that we need to be careful of, not to fall into these kind of old maps and old models and old ways of thinking that we're so like fixated on polishing these arguments that we've been working on for like 10-15 years now, that we start to miss what is happening with like neoliberal forces across the globe, notably Joe Biden, right? There's been a lot of talk about how large this most recent stimulus package was, right? um we talked about this with Matt Karp last week. Obviously, Joe Biden is no socialist. He's not a progressive, and we're not going to get any kind of social democracy from Joe Biden. But what we are seeing is that there's a willingness on their part to not be so afraid of doing, spending, basically, like they were in the past. Like, this new package from Biden is way more than Obama. As what we saw from Trump was historically huge package as well. What I mean by that is that political like consensus around these issues is changing. Boris Johnson is another example of this in the UK. And when we talked to Grace Blakely, we said the exact same thing, which is like there were all these people like, oh, is Boris Johnson now doing like some kind of like conservative socialism, right, where they're going to like basically do stimulus at a large scale and keep it with their kind of hyper reactionary politics. Now, obviously, Boris Johnson's, stimulus to the country and the program that they've tried to do there have not been some kind of, we're just going to mix like social democratic politics with right wing. They've been incredibly inadequate and have, allowed a lot of people who are already very well off to be even more well off. Very similar to what we've seen in the United States, right? But we are seeing a little bit more willingness to spend public money from our opponents. I'm talking about Joe Biden, Boris Johnson, right? Folks like that. And the reason I've been thinking about this is like, okay, I think this is an important time for everyone to do a kind of reflection about how we're analyzing politics so that we don't fall into, like, if you know an argument if you know an argument well enough that it's going to be a winning argument, or at least you can feel really strong about your argument, a lot of times people will try to change the scenario, the way that they frame it, to make their argument work. And I think that would be a very, very dangerous thing for the left to do. In the same way that like the third way was very effective at breaking out of the old paradigm. What I mean by effective, it was like very effective at completely sidelining the left. We have to be careful that, okay, so now we have a very sustained criticism of that kind of third way politics. If we start to see, as I think that we are, something new being born, and again, it might not be some kind of radical rupture or break or anything like that, but it just is a kind of ruling class politics in a different form. We need to be careful that we're not missing these big shifts in global capital. And the reason I started thinking about this is I was going back to a book by Jean-Paul Sartre called Search for a Method. And for some of y'all, you might be familiar with Sartre as like one of the famous existentialist philosophers. Others, especially people, who, other people might be a little bit more familiar with Sartre's political theory. And then even a very small and select group of folks who really, fall and read this stuff might be a little surprised that I'm talking about Sartre in this context at all, because, Sartre's stuff, I'll say this. When I was a lot younger, I was very interested in Sartre as a political thinker. As I've gotten older, I've really gotten frustrated with, what I would just call in the most basic terms, like just squishy thought. I still think Sartre is incredibly useful. And the book Search for a Method is very interesting. I've just become a little bit more interested in reading people who are a little bit more concrete, like Lenin and Panich. But that's just me. Anyways, that doesn't mean that I don't think there's a lot of lessons in these ideas in their work. And it's not even me saying that I'm rejecting them. I'm just more saying that I'm a little bit less focused on, I'm going to break down all of Sartre's arguments. I actually just want to break down the very beginning of that book, where he makes a very insightful point. So for folks who aren't familiar, he, Sartre was one of the great existentialist philosophers, and for most of its history, existentialism was very much in combat with Marxism. Over time, Sartre very much shifted on this question and tried to include existentialism as like a part of Marxism. So basically, he argued that Marxism was the philosophy of his time. And existentialism was just, a school of thought of that. In fact, he actually goes as far as to say, it's like existentialism was a bit early. existentialism as a philosophy. Existentialism is the philosophy of freedom. That the conditions that would be necessary to make like existentialism like properly and fully applicable, the political conditions would actually necessitate a socialist revolution, a Marxist revolution. The Marxist idea was the groundwork that was needed to make existentialism possible. Very, very interesting and provocative like argument, especially for people who consider any kind of philosophy of individual freedom as something that is an antithesis of Marxism or Marx communism. Sartre is very much saying no. But anyways, I don't want to get too bogged down on that. If people are interested in it, maybe later we can in the chat. But I want to make this point very quickly so I don't lose the people who aren't interested in philosophy on this. Which is that, he makes this argument that each time, each like period of history, like has its own philosophy, where like a rising class is like becoming like, kind of typical Marxist arguments, like the proletariat is becoming conscious of itself as a political class. So that's going to create kind of like ideological and political and philosophical ruptures. Sartre makes this argument. This is actually like a historical trend. So somebody asked me in the post game, I think last Thursday, about my thoughts on like liberalism as a political philosophy. Well, in this kind of Sartrean model, what you're seeing with liberalism is this, this bourgeois class becoming politically aware of itself as a class, and the model of government and the model of thinking and legalism and things like that are necessary for the bourgeoisie to become, the top ruling class, are very much borne out in like liberal philosophy. So Sartre is here saying that two things is that, like, okay, one, like philosophy itself, there's a dominant philosophy. There's plenty of other philosophies that exist in all times, but there's one that ends up winning out, right? And that is very much going to be dictated by the movement of class throughout history, right? It's a very Marxist kind of read of that. But he also makes an interesting point too, where it's like the philosophy that also means that like the philosophy that is like the main philosophy that like people are familiar with, just because it's like what they were instructed in, tends to be like the old one, right? Right. So it's like, like liberalism, as like a philosophical project becomes realized through this class struggle, but it's also like in the time that we're reading it now, like those are already that's the dominant system, but not necessarily the expression of like the rising class, right? So I bring that up just because it's an interesting way to think about ideas in this sense, where there's like a lag time between like ideas and like their realization. So what we're seeing, especially with our arguments against this kind of like more traditional conception of like what neoliberalism is, or like I should actually say, instead of neoliberalism, like austerity, right? We know the arguments against austerity. That if we lean too much into that as like our framework for thinking about politics and class struggle, we could get ourselves into a position where we enter into something a period of time, as I think we're starting to see, where those kind of old models and old like frameworks that we're used to thinking of aren't as accurate to the time that we're in, right? And what I mean by that is just like Joe Biden is doing something a little bit different than Bill Clinton, but what remains the same is who he is serving as his primary constituency, which is the ruling class and the ruling class ideology. The way that he is doing that might be different from Bill Clinton, right? So we might not be in a situation where the goal is to slash all of the welfare programs, right? Like we saw with Bill Clinton, but the goal is the same, in that what Biden wants to do is the same that Clinton want to do, which is to make sure that these, the popular classes, the working classes, do not find a way to mobilize and organize themselves into a coherent political movement, right? The tactics have changed, but the goal's the same. And I think that sometimes, especially people who have come into the socialist movement recently, there's a fixation on the tactics and not that kind of overarching historical movement, because they're always going to be shifting the way that they govern, and so we're never just going to have this continuous like carbon copy of like the same enemy and the same formation there, right? We have to be as dynamic as our opponents are, and that means intellectually as well, without ever losing our greatest like philosophical asset, which is like the like dialectical materialism and a critique of capitalism, right? Like those are the rocks of the analysis. But if you think, you can't make that's a moving philosophy, right? Because like being a Marxist means you see society is actually shifting, right? There's early capitalism, right? There are developments that happen, and it's not always the same. But what is the same is, profit being the motor of the system, the class system, right? The need, though changing in its effect, and how prevalent it is of like the repressive state apparatus, the police, the military, and stuff like that, to maintain social order, right? The importance of ideology to maintain, like those things don't disappear. I'm not saying rejecting those things. I'm saying be dynamic, like those systems are meant to be dynamic, and be able to apply them to a moving historical system instead of being, dogmatic and still, because that's how we will get outflanked. And that has been a great way, a very effective way of how our opponents have always been able to sort of move into a new dynamic of capital while we're still debating what the hell happened, the last 20 years, right? I'm not saying don't do historical analysis or anything like that. I'm just saying, we just can't think that we've got it all figured, especially if it can, fit on as like a neat little slogan. So that's my kind of like general rant and warning there. So let me make sure I'm not missing anything in the chat. I'm curious what y'all think about that. I'm just like, I think especially like the austerity thing, and my UK friends tell me if I'm wrong about this, but I think that there was a difficulty that there in the campaigning, in the second Corbyn campaign, regarding austerity, because there were these shifts that you started to see in the Conservative Party. Not that they weren't ruthless, or not that they weren't a party of capital through and through, but they had sort of received some of that critique and were doing things to shift it. So that leaning so hard into the austerity formula as your main argument wasn't as convincing as it was in the first Corbyn campaign, for example, right? And I think we'll see that again. And I think we're starting to see that with Biden, where it's like, if we just do like Obama criticism with Biden, we could actually get a clips where to the average person we're trying to convince, it doesn't ring as true, because it's not that it's inaccurate in the sense of like Biden's wishes and who he's serving, but the tactics aren't really the same anymore. Let me see. And Billy says success for Biden would be a placate working class. No, exactly. Zachary says, do you think that the time of austerity politics is done and the time of kind corporate Keynesian politics is on the rise? I don't think that we can sit here and say anything's done. I don't think austerity is done. It's still a very, very popular political force. It's easy to sell. I think, though, the fidelity of like the majority of like the ruling parties, and I'm concluding they're both Democrat and Republican, is shifting on this, right? Where it's like there are some Democrats who still, will use the House budget metaphor for why we can't have this, or that, right? Austerity is still a political force and an idea in our politics, but is it as dominant as it was? I think that's starting to shift, and I just think that we need to be expanding our criticisms of this system and this kind of way of politics from just being that focused on that, because again, that's just the way that we can get stuck in an old model, like what happened, with the rise of the third way. All right, let me make sure I'm not missing any more of these of these questions here. I think what we're seeing too is that there is a dynamic shift in a positive direction. For example, in South America right now, where left parties are recognizing that it doesn't matter how much you play ball with the United States and your opponents, they will try to coup you. Um, I think that what's happening in Bolivia, and I think we should do something more in depth on this later on Left Reckoning. But one of the things that happened after Moss came into power was, I remember talking privately to friends. It's like, okay, well now there has to be a restructuring of the military and the police force because those systems almost immediately went into the hands of the right wing, right? Those are kind of like historical lessons that the left is learning there that I think are very positive. Of course, we're going to get bloviating from the OAS and right wingers in the United States, along with obviously their friends and handmaidens like liberals in this country. But this shift is a positive development of these movements having a strong understanding of the state theory and the apparatuses that they're up against. Yeah, let me see. I want to make sure I'm getting to these questions. So I think, I could continue going on about this as we go. I'll answer some of these questions that I'm seeing here, but definitely feel free to jump into the chat, with questions. I'm open to talk about anything really. I haven't been following like internet drama, I will say. So anything like that, I'm probably not going to have anything too deep on. But very happy to answer questions. We always appreciate super chats. And we're going to be talking on Thursday about Lula da Silva, which I'm very excited for. Noah says, why are so many online leftists intolerant of slightly different opinions? If I was new to politics, it might alienate me from socialist thought. Thanks, Noah. I would, first of all, I think one of the great essays on this is always going to be Mark Fisher. And I know, there's some people who get very annoyed by that, by so leaning on that, but I think it's very important. Because not only does he fixate on like a very particular like moment in the left, and he's primarily talking about the UK left, but he finds the tactics of it and the kind of ideology and just what he calls exiting the vampire castle is the name of the essay. And apart from like the actual criticisms of people's positions and stuff like that he makes, I think the most lasting impact and why it's worth continuing to revisit is because he really structures the way that vampire castle system works, right? Particularly that it's very much like a Christian ideology, in the sense, and Christian in the most in a pejorative sense, like Christian in like its willingness to condemn the unsaved. And forgive those within like your little clique, but also in the very Christian tradition, very, very prone to fragmentation as well, right? As we see by all of the different sects that have proliferated throughout Christianity, right? Like that's a part of his argument, and that's essentially what we do see, especially online. But I think online in particular is bad just because this is what happens when you're not engaging with people in real space, and you're selling yourself as an image of yourself. What do I mean by that? It's like your like digital self is like some kind of weird funhouse mirror of like who you are, and to maintain that like image, you oftentimes like need your opposite. You need to have the other lefties who you condemn. I think that's like the kind of left analysis that you can give to it, but also a lot of it is just kind of general narcissism of unfortunately a very sick culture. Zachary says, don't follow internet drama. It's probably a good idea. Comrade J, Andrew World says, do you have a dry rub recipe you're willing to share? I'll do grill tips one day, maybe, if y'all would be interested in that. I do like when I'm doing beef, I usually keep it, brisket or something like that. I'm salt and pepper. Chicken, I like to use as many chilies as possible. Make them up into like a nice paste, garlic powder, salt, pepper. I really like that kind of like smoky flavor. So that's usually where I lean into. Yeah, Kyle says Adolf Reed would say it's puritanical. Yeah. puritanical, but he also makes the point that it's very much like a consequence of Protestantism, which is very funny since he sort of grew up around the Catholic community. M. Toussaint says, do you think Bessemer will really unionize? Are they actually voting for Amazon to shut down that plant? Well, they're not voting for Amazon to shut down that plant. They're voting to make sure that they get proper wages and representation, and that their basic needs can be met, including things like they have to walk across the equivalent of a few football fields to get their lunch, and that's on a time break. They don't have the freedom to use the restroom. I mean, there's just like basic human dignity standards, along with increased safety and higher wages. Do I think that they will really unionize? I mean, the solidarity movements that we've seen have been incredible. The stories that these workers have been telling have been amazing. This is a long, long fight. I believe very much that this can happen. And, they're up against a giant that is doing everything that they can to intimidate folks. So I think it's our job in the public to say, we're here for y'all and we support you. And we're following this all the way through, right? There is not going to be a moment where you're going to be forgotten and Amazon is just going to be able to have like repercussions against folks without public outcry and support, right? M. Toussaint says, if they unionize, do you think they'll shut down the plant? I don't think that they will. Like the advantage of unionizing at Amazon, it's very hard because Amazon is a huge corporation that's pushing us, as much as it can to prevent that from ever happening. But they are also strategically placed, right? Like Amazon needs to have physical locations everywhere if they want to continue the business model that they have, which is being a basically online store for everything. So they don't have the option really of shutting down like all these plants. They could do it there to, maybe make a point, but they would have to reopen elsewhere, and it would cost them a lot of money. And at the end of the day, they're more worried about their bottom line than anything else. Let me see. Okay. Getting support for grill tips. I also think next week I might be trying to do this outside, which I think is going to be awesome. Let me see, y'all. I think I want to make sure that I'm not missing any questions. It's coming a little quick, and y'all are doing basketball stuff, which I support. I wish I could get into it a little bit more. Do I think, Noah says, do you think the left should embrace pop culture rather than rejecting it? Should we see popular cultural events as an instance of communal joy and connection? Yeah, man, I think so. Absolutely. I think that it's not helpful to have, if you want to have a political movement, you have to be very much engaged in popular culture. And I don't mean that actually in the sense of like pop culture. I mean that be involved in communities and in the things that everyone else, be a part of your community. That's a big part of like left reckoning. I say this a lot about like, Southerners who become leftists. It's like they have this kind of like feeling that to be a proper leftist, they have to reject like their community and everything around them. It's like, look, we all like our own different things. And I don't think that it's worth it to like pretend to like something that you don't. But there very much is like a left-wing culture, and I don't think that's a good thing. I think it's, for every, I'm not going to come up with any good analogies here, but like, for every person who's very much like in the scene, we need people who at NASCAR who are left wingers. Like if we want to win, that's the only way that's ever going to happen. We can't do two things at once, which is like create an alternative popular culture in the United States, and at the same time is also building a strong like left-wing political movement. Like we need to make sure that we are very much involved in organic communities and not trying to just create our own completely separate like echo chamber. I think that would be disastrous. All right. I'm trying to make sure I'm not missing anything. Get into sports. Yeah. Don't say sports ball. I think that's probably a good lesson, y'all. It's like one thing. It's like, football, for example, is is, has a lot of like exploitation in it. It's a sport that has horrible histories around race. I mean, this recent stuff that we've been seeing from the NFL is just disgusting. If folks aren't familiar with this. Um, Basically, like the NFL is using like quota systems to deny claims of black players for head injuries. Just absolutely disgusting stuff. But I don't think like not participating in watching football, for example, is like the way to handle it, because then you just give the keys to our opponents. And the funniest thing is the ones who've been the most effective actually at like walking away from football has been the wacky Republicans. Kyle says, "What do I think about the Eyes of Texas drama?" For folks who, I'll give you my top line on it. It's like it's disgusting. A great example of why it's terrible. What happens when you have a bunch of rich people being able to dictate terms to everybody else? It's a song. Like honestly, there's if I were like an online troll, I'd make fun of the people who get really worked up about it. It's like, what kind of like, whiny guy are you that you're worried that like your team isn't singing your favorite song? Like, come on, man. Like it's really ridiculous. But more like substantively, it's an example of what happens when rich people get to dictate terms. And effectively, I'm not going to do the whole Eyes of Texas thing for everybody right now, but if anyone's curious, there's an old song that they sing at the end of Texas football games. They make the players sing it. During the Black Lives Matter protests, a lot of people came up and they said they didn't want to sing it because it has a history of being sung in minstrel shows and things like that. And effectively, what happened behind the scenes was the boosters, the people who give the program millions and millions of dollars, said, you make them sing that song or we're going to walk away. And they ended up firing Tom Herman, who needed to be fired for his like bad coaching. But that was a big reason that he got fired. Anyways, it's just another example of like, we don't want these things to be held in in the hands of super wealthy folks like this, because they're disgusting pigs who don't represent the vast majority of people. Because the vast majority of people who watch Texas football games, except for the most wacky people, like don't care about the song, right? But it's these boosters, just like these old guys who want to like have the kind of like fraternity like mentality. Anyways, that's my take on Eyes of Texas. Cowboys is another great example of that. The team that should immediately be put into public ownership, not only because of the mismanagement of the team by the current owner, but also his profiteering off of the people in the state of Texas during this horrible, pandemic. Let me see. Yeah. People talking about super chats, hit us up. Let me make sure I'm not missing everybody. Okay, Kyle, who's your team? Someone pointed out last week that my mountains were fake. Yeah, man. It'd be pretty amazing if I was recording live from Yellowstone every week. I'm sorry, whomever got banned from TYT. I don't know much about what's going on over there. The Green Bay Packers model works, but like I think the Green Bay Packers model, if I understand it, it's like it's not fully fan owned in like the most pure sense. So I think there's even better models than that, but definitely is a more, a better way to go about that. Well, let me see, y'all. If there aren't any more questions, I might be heading out in a second. I want to, again, for folks who just joined, a couple of projects that we're going to be doing we're going to be doing something on James Connolly. And we're going to try to turn that into a patrons bonus content series where we're basically going to go through like great thinkers in the history of the left. So I think the first one we're going to be hanging out with is what's it called? Sorry, the first one, Paul O'Connell, our friend from the UK, is going to be joining us to do that, and that's going to be really exciting. I'd love to do other ones on like Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg. If y'all have suggestions, please hit us up with those in the future. I think those are going to be really fun because I want to talk to people, like, because I know, like, Paul O'Connell. The reason I thought about this is like he always changes his like Twitter picture to picture Connolly. I was like, there's all these people who are very much influenced by these thinkers, and it could be really fun to have folks on to talk about the history of those folks and why they're important to them. Billy Big Bricks says Tyrod Taylor to the Texans. Is Deshaun Watson out? I think so. It seems like he's been trying to find his way out. I don't blame him. The Texans as a franchise is just extremely, disappointing. I wouldn't want to be there if I had the talent that he does. Kenzo's in the stream. Thanks so much, Kenzo. Jay Andrew is hungry. He wants these grill tips. I'm down. Like, I think, I'll try to find the best way to do it, but I'd love to do some Griscom grill streams out there. I think that'd be a lot of fun. AFC Wimbledon is a locally fan-owned soccer club in London. They're third tier, but inspiring. I love that. Definitely check out Paul Morin on YouTube for Irish Marxists. Yeah, I think you sent this to me, right? I have it saved somewhere. I was going to look at this later. Did I know we have an IMDb page? I had no idea about that. Texans are a doo-doo ass franchise. I think that's about right. Could you talk about Gramsci and his response to the question of, are you free in a social society? I'd be very happy to talk about Gramsci. I'm not, just off the cuff, I'm not familiar with this, particular part of his work. I'd love to investigate that. David Grillsome, hell yeah. How's that Taco Cabana? Those breakfast burritos at the Broken Spoke. That's a regional taco place. The funniest thing is because I drove down to Texas, and I was like, man, I have to get like a good old like Texas meal for my first thing. But I had so much barbecue on my drive, because like every day I'd stop for barbecue in Tennessee, which I had really good barbecue in Knoxville, surprisingly, and a little bit subpar in Memphis, I must say. But I think that was just the place that I went to. But I was like, really want to get barbecue, but I was just like, I can't eat any more meat. So I went to Taco Cabana. That was my first return to Texas meal. So I like it, man. It's fun as hell. It's a perfect place to go off on the side of the road. Let me see. Taco Cabana breakfast tacos are so good. Do they have Taco Cabanas up in Chicago? I'm not sure about that. I've been like, man, there's a joint near my house that has just like the best breakfast tacos. I've been showing up there every day. It's gotten a little bit embarrassing because they know me by name now and what I like. But it is very, very good and very cheap, which I always appreciate. How was the drive through states during COVID? That was interesting, just because it was it was just an interesting experience to see in different places. And I'd been, I went to Portland, Oregon for about 4 months during COVID. And that was very different from New York. Going through the South, I was expecting it to be a little bit more intense, but it's basically what it was everywhere else, man. It's like big cities or those areas around it. Everyone's doing the rules. And then, the more depressed towns, rural towns, like people were really, worked up about folks not wearing the mask. People got, a little wild with me, passing through the gas station, but nothing too bad. But it was an interesting thing to realize that, everyone's doing different, it's very different all across the board. I mean, it was like the same thing. I went up to upstate New York in July or so. I don't know. Actually, that's not true. October, Jesus Christ. Yeah, because it was for my birthday. And that was like really intense anti-mask stuff too. So I don't think it's particularly regional. Yeah, and Kenzo says, we don't have Taco Cabana in Chicago, just really good taquerias. I can attest to that. I love Chicago Mexican food. But breakfast tacos breakfast tacos really haven't taken off anywhere else. And any other place, when other places trying to do like Austin style breakfast tacos, I'm saying places outside Texas, they just suck. And I'm just going to skip that. One of the saddest moments of my life was having a breakfast taco, like at a breakfast taco place in Brooklyn. That is probably up there with the one time I had that barbecue place that everyone raves about there called Hometown, which is just awful. It just like it makes me sadder to eat that than to not have my favorite foods. You know what I'm saying? Like it's worse. Like if you're craving something, it's worse to be presented with like a bad knockoff version of it than the real thing. Austin is the breakfast. You said burrito, but it's breakfast taco. Um, Yeah, I don't know, y'all. I think Matt and I are trying to bump up the amount of stuff we're putting out. I think we might really start doing more stuff on Twitch too. Just let us know what you're interested in. I really appreciate input from folks, what they like and are interested in. We really want to make sure that we get these extra bonus episodes out for patrons on a more regular basis. We're going to be working a little bit more on getting out these bonus interviews as well. I'm going to be talking to Seneca Savoy from Austin DSA tomorrow. I don't know. I think we might put that on Sunday. And then Thursday, we're going to be talking with Victor Puggi about Lula, Lava Jato, and what comes next. I'm really looking forward to that for all of y'all's reactions to it. And we have some pretty exciting stuff coming up the next couple of weeks. So definitely keep your eye out. I'll be back on this on a weekly basis. I'm thinking Tuesdays are working good for me right now. So I think we'll keep this going on for a little while. And let's do it again. Talk to y'all next week. Bye.